صلوا على النور يا أحمد الله نور المنازل يا محمد
Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. They say just as our bodies need nourishment to survive, our souls need to be nourished as well. But the question is, how often do we feed our souls? Welcome to Soul Food, a podcast about spiritual refinement. My name is Amjad Tarsin, and I invite you to embark with me on this journey inward to work on our souls. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to episode 8 of Soul Food, titled Modesty. In this episode, we're going to talk about the danger of unrestrained desires. We'll talk about the beauty of modesty. And finally, we'll talk about the importance of preserving the purity of the Fitra, the natural state that Allah instilled within us. The spiritual path, this path of drawing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our merciful and generous Lord, is all about purifying the nafs, going against the inclinations and the desires of the lower self. And the nafs inclines towards things that are actually harmful to us and that veil us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and distance us from Him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually, in His mercy and wisdom, He allows certain things to manifest that are harmful when we do things that are forbidden, in order for us to recognize the harmfulness and the danger of giving into those lower desires and doing things that He is not pleased with, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But without divine guidance, people can easily be deceived into thinking that they should do whatever feels good. I want to just have fun all the time, and I just want to live it up and enjoy my life. And a lot of people live that way, thinking that that's going to give them happiness. But in reality, this quote-unquote freedom that is just unrestrained desires has actually caused a lot of damage. People today are dealing with all different types of afflictions and difficulties spiritually and physically and mentally. And this is because of giving into these lower desires. And in all aspects of our lives, whether it's professional, whether it's our educational pursuits, and especially as it relates to our spiritual path of devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeking those higher levels of nearness with Him, we, in all of those areas, have to be mindful of giving into our lower desires. For example, if someone just spent time all day playing games, it doesn't mean that you can't have some leisure time, but let's say someone just did that all day and all night. They wouldn't be able to get to the important things in their life. They wouldn't be able to fulfill their responsibilities. Or if someone ate whatever they wanted, and this is a very natural desire that we are attracted to delicious foods, but if someone ate whatever they wanted all the time, that person would become unhealthy. And just like exercise, physical exercise is challenging in the moment, it actually feels healthy and ultimately is very rewarding. And the same goes for spiritual discipline. It's challenging. Going against your lower nafs doesn't feel good in the moment, but being aligned with divine beauty and guidance gives a person the deepest sense of fulfillment and achievement. So it's not easy, but it's absolutely worth it. This brings us to the next point, the beauty of modesty. Modesty in Arabic is called haya, stems from the heart's awareness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees us. So we refrain from anything that is unbecoming before Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when dealing with others, this sense of modesty or haya comes from the intrinsic sense of dignity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, which stems from the Fitra, this natural way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us from birth. And the Prophet ﷺ said about haya that it beautifies us. وَمَا كَانَ الْحَيَاءُ فِي شَيْءٍ إِلَّا زَانَ. In a hadith narrated by Imam al-Tirmidhi, that he said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, whenever haya, modesty, is within a thing, it beautifies it. Whenever someone exhibits modesty, it beautifies and adorns that thing. But when modesty is torn away from a person, they actually become undignified and dehumanized. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, in Surah 7, verse 20, the story of Adam and Eve and how the devil wanted to strip them of their dignity and how he wanted to embarrass them and expose them in a way that was unbecoming. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَوَسْوَسَ لَهُمَا الشَّيْطَانُ لِيُبْدِيَ لَهُمَا مَا وُورِيَ عَنْهُمَا مِنْ سَوْآتِهِمَا. Then Satan tempted them in order to expose what was hidden of their nakedness. So when they ate from the tree, they were surrounded in light, that the light was so intense that none of their body parts were showing because of the intensity of the light. But when they ate from the tree after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade them from that, then the light was dimmed and they were able to see certain parts of themselves that weren't previously exposed. And that's because the devil wanted to take them down from the exalted status that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. So this shows us that true beauty is found in modesty. And the opposite of that is actually crude and repulsive, even if it's glamorized, even if society, people are obsessed with that. It's actually a part of us, part of the nafs that is attracted to that, that is not good for us. And modesty and appreciating beauty, for example, in marriage, is actually deeply aligned with spiritual beauty and the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. This brings us to the final point, preserving the fitrah. Our actions impact our hearts. We have to know that. And our actions impact our iman, our faith. And modesty begins with knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees us and that we intend to fulfill His divine commandments. And one of those areas, for example, is the way that we dress. And modest clothing, which is clearly defined in Islam, it actually affects the way that we carry ourselves and it dignifies us. Some people might think like this is old-fashioned, it's not with the times, but it actually highlights and preserves the true beauty within the human being for both men and women. And it's different for both, but it does that same purpose. It fulfills that same purpose. And our modesty is not limited to what we wear, but it's a big part of it. But it's not limited to that, because we know that what we wear impacts the way that we carry ourselves. But modesty also applies to the way that we speak, the way that we carry ourselves. Even our very thoughts and aspirations can be colored by haya and modesty, that we carry ourselves with dignity. We speak in a way that is noble and respectful. And when we carry ourselves that way and we preserve that haya within us, it actually preserves our fitrah and our faith. The Prophet ﷺ said in an authentic hadith, إِنَّ الْحَيَاءَ وَالْإِيمَانَ قُرَنَاءَ جَمِيعًا, that faith and modesty are joined with each other. فَإِذَا رُفِعَ أَحَدُهُمَا رُفِعَ الْآخَرُ. If one of them is lost, the other is lost. So we have to strengthen our awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to push up against the tide that really wants to remove any sort of recognition of modesty, of human dignity, of shyness, of covering ourselves, carrying ourselves in a dignified way. It wants to remove all of that and just give into the most animalistic, lower desires. But we have to strengthen our awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and hold to His way. And one of the ways that we can do that to preserve our fitra, which then impacts us in these other ways, is also by being in touch with nature. That we cultivate our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation, which increases our awareness of Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that we also invest in the dignity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed within us by preserving our modesty. This brings us now to the call to action. Imam al-Sha'rani, he mentions a very high level of modesty where some righteous people, they in their heart, they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for permission before engaging in any action, which is amazing if you think about it. It's a very high level. They ask Allah. That's because they have haya and they recognize that He sees them in every moment. So the way that they cultivate that awareness is by asking Allah permission for every action. And this teaches us, even though we might not necessarily be at that level, it teaches us what our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be like. But for us now, the call to action is that the next time you enter into the prayer, the next time you're going to pray salah, in your heart, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for permission to be entered into His presence, for permission to truly stand before Him in salah and see how that impacts your prayer and see how that impacts your modesty as a whole. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to preserve our dignity and to make us keys that open doors of goodness and locks that close the doors of evil, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala restores the goodness to humanity, the dignity that people have been given by virtue of their soul, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the strength and the determination and His enabling grace that allows us to overcome our lower desires, and that we are not controlled by them, but that we are dignified and elevated through His obedience. وصلى الله تعالى على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you for listening to Soul Food. To subscribe to the show, visit soulfood.fm or search for Soul Food in your favorite podcast player. And while you're there, take a minute to leave us a rating and a review. It helps more people discover the show.